Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adolfo Ovies, and I am the author of The Boy Generals, George Custer, Wesley Merritt, and the Cavalry of the Army of the Potomac. It's a trilogy published by Savas Beatty. Volume 1 is kind of an introductory volume. It has the Peninsula Campaign and carries on through to the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Volume 2 picks up on the pursuit of Lee's beaten army and carries through the Battle of Yellow Tavern, Trevilian Station, and ends with the opening weeks of the Shenandoah Valley campaign. And Volume 3 ends with the Shenandoah Valley camp and begins with the Shenandoah Valley campaign and carries on through to Appomattox and just a little bit of Phil Sheridan's Texas campaign. And that's pretty much where it ends. I make no attempt to cover anything that happened to Custer or Merritt after the end of the war. Volumes 1 and 2 have been printed, and I thought that I would focus my presentation today, since I have done completed volume 3. I wanted to not focus on some of the stuff that I might have talked in the past on several of the presentations I've made to the Civil War Congress, Roundtable Congress, and focus almost exclusively on Merritt and Custer in the Shenandoah Valley. Okay, so we've got two very distinct personalities here. We have Custer the Hussar, and we have Merritt the Dragoon. And on top is Merritt the Dragoon, and next to it would be Dragoon in a utilitarian uniform that was worn back during the days of the Napoleonic Wars and maybe a little bit later. But you can see that it's no frills. It's a very basic outfit, very basic weaponry. And then we have Custer the Hussar, and you can see from the picture below that it's kind of mimicked in Custer's uniform. It's got the gold braid, it's got the pelisse hanging over his shoulder, the big shackle with a gold chain around it. And if you look at Custer's uniform, he's got the broad-collared sailor shirt. He's got the gold braid all the way up to the elbow of his uniform. It's a black velveteen uniform as opposed to the regular blue uniform that was used at the time by the Union forces. So all in all, it's a very picturesque, very flamboyant uniform, and it kind of differentiates the two men, right? If you say that, a couple of pictures tells a story, these two pictures tell the difference in the personality of these two men. Wesley Merritt was a graduate of the class of 1860. The class of 1860 at the time was under the Department of Engineers, and the Secretary of War at that time was Jefferson Davis, who would go on to become President of the Confederate States of America. And he felt that because of the heavy emphasis on a curriculum based on science and geography and mathematics, that it really didn't leave much time for the training of a soldier, which was really the purpose of what a West Point education was, which is, let's make a soldier. So he added a 5th course to the class, and it was the only class, the class of 1860, that had 5 terms. And Wesley Merritt would graduate and go, he would be assigned to the 2nd Dragoons, and he would head west and serve with the 2nd Dragoons in the Utah Territory. George Custer was a member of the class of 1861. The fact that he graduated at all is, it can be seen in a good way or it can be seen in a bad way. He was a notorious prankster, full of life, one of the favorites of his class. But by the same token, he was always in trouble with the amount of demerits that he got. There was one year where he managed to rack up 99 demerits. And if you got 100 demerits, you were thrown out of the academy. It just kind of goes to show you the kind of self-discipline that Custer was capable of, that he managed to go the rest of the year without getting that one demerit that would have ended his military career. At the end of his military career, he was serving as officer of the guard one day, and a couple of the incoming cadets got into a fight, and it was clear that Custer's uh, duty as officer of the guard was to maintain the peace and tranquility of the academy. And instead, he got in between the two combatants and in a clear voice said, "Let there be a fair fight, boys." And the officer of the day came out, heard the whole thing, had Custer arrested, and Custer was court-martialed. Uh, Luckily for him, it was right at the start of the Civil War, and the need for a trained officer was paramount. Custer never found out what his sentence was. He went directly to Washington, D.C. with a stopover in New York to get his lieutenant's uniform, and was present at the Battle of First Bull Run or Manassas, depending on how you want to look at it. So Custer was the first one of the two men to see action. The trip from Utah to the railhead on the Mississippi River took forever for the Second Dragoons. I think it was 2 months long. So it was quite a while before Merritt was able to make his appearance on the Eastern Theater of War. So one of the things I really wanted to concentrate on is the role of the press and how these two men uh, handled the press, because uh, they definitely had different outlooks on the thing. Just to give you a little bit of a background, the whole thing got started when General Joseph Hooker was appointed to the command of the Army of the Potomac shortly after Chancellorsville, around the time of Chancellorsville, and he complained to Halleck, who was chief of the army at the time, that the newspapers were reporting everything he did, knew the exact movements of every one of his commands. In fact, they even knew exactly where his headquarters was. So by this time, the reporters that were covering the war had turned into a hard riding uh, lot. They had started out with fancy uniforms, horses with all the accoutrements that would, uh, everything was really fancy. But within a short time, they had become pretty much like the cavalrymen that they were covered. They were inured to hardship. They carried a revolver. They had their notebook, a pen, or a pencil, and it was cutthroat competition, just like it is nowadays. You didn't want to be outscooped by your competitors, and they traveled with the army. And by that time, they were just reduced to, like I say, they would have a horse, a saddle, a notebook, a pen, and a revolver, and that was pretty much it. In his complaint to Halleck, Halleck had said that he had encountered pretty much the same problems when he was commanding troops before he went to Washington. And he said, he told Hooker that as long as we're allowing reporters into our camps, there's not going to be any way that they're not going to be able to report the news. And he said the only way to do that is to keep them out of our camps. But by the same token, he wasn't going to make a general order out of it, and that every general was to decide exactly how he was going to address the issues created by the press. A lot of this has to do with the mentors of Merritt and Custer. Uh, on Custer's side, we have George McClellan and Alfred Pleasanton. Uh, Both were notorious for their affinity to the press. to see their names splattered in the headlines. Alfred Pleasanton, in particular, was known to be a real news hound, have his name in the newspaper all the time. Merritt, on the other hand, had Philip St. George Cook and John Buford. They were old cavalrymen who believed that what happened in the Army should stay in the Army. And Merritt fell into that, and he kept the newspapermen out of these camps. So here's the difference in attitude. Custer worked really hard at establishing a compatible relationship with the press. Reporters were welcome at his mess. They would get a hot meal. They would find him ready to talk about military matters. As a result, his name was featured extensively in the newspapers. I believe there was an issue of Harper's Weekly where an entire 2 pages was devoted to a small raid that he participated in. It was a mere distraction, a diversionary attack, and yet it ended up covering 2 pages in Harper's Weekly. Merritt, like I say, believed that what happened in the Army should stay in the Army. He refused to recognize the role that the press played in decimating the information to the American reading public, and he underestimated just how interested the American reading public was in the goings on of the war. And it proved to be a little bit of an Achilles heel for him. His name was very rarely mentioned in the newspaper, and of course, it had a little bit of an effect on the morale of his men, because maybe Merritt didn't want to see his name in the newspaper, being the kind of modest, self-effacing guy that he was, but a soldier and always likes to see the name of his unit featured in the newspaper. So to some extent, Merritt's attitude towards the press affected the morale of his men. A typical example of what I'm talking about happened during on August 16th during the Shenandoah Valley campaign. It was an article written by Edward A. Paul of the New York Times. And as you can see here, he writes about the Battle of Crooked Run, also known as the Battle of Guard Hill. And pretty much, aside from the first column, the entire story is about Custer's actions at Guard Hill, Crooked Run. And in that entire 2.5 columns of tightly spaced text, Merritt's name is mentioned one time, and it was basically 2 sentences long. James H. Kidd, who was a member of Custer's Michigan Brigade, would go on to say that the encounter at Front Royal, which was really the Battle of Crooked Run and Guard Hill, was one of the most brilliant affairs of the war, and illustrated well the marvelous intuition with which General Custer often grasped the situation. In the meantime, the only thing that was written about Merritt, that entire series of that article, was General Merritt was busily engaged on the field directing the movement of troops and showed himself to be a commander of no mean ability. And out of all that print, that was all that was said about Merritt. Here's another example of just how much Custer appeared in the newspapers. This is Custer at the Battle of Winchester. And these are different artists. We have A.R. Wild, we have Forbes, we have James Taylor. These are guys, and every one of these photographs here, every one of these sketches here shows Custer in action at the Battle of Winchester, the Third Winchester, in September 19th of 1864 during Sheridan's Shenandoah Valley campaign. And yet there isn't a single sketch or a single photograph or a single anything about Wesley Merritt in this entire page. So again, his lack of being able to get along with the press proved to be a hindrance to him and a hindrance to the morale of his men. Uh, it wasn't all good news that Custer received. He received his fair share of critical news accounts. He was spotted at the beginning of the Shenandoah Valley campaign in Front Royal, wearing his trademark outfit with the long red cravat and the black velveteen jacket. And unfortunately, people noticed him. And when things go wrong, their attention was drawn to Custer instead of other people. Such an example would be the case of the hanging of Mosby's men at Front Royal. And it was on the retreat down the Luray Valley that uh, a portion of Merritt's command captured 7 of Mosby's men, and they were executed either by gunshot or 2 of them were actually hanged, which was what Grant's order dictated. Where any of Mosby's men are captured, hang them on the spot. So Charles Russell Lowell, who was the guy that captured Mosby's men, would write to his wife and say, I was sorry enough the other day that my brigade, should have had a part in the hanging and shooting of some of Mosby's men. So in a letter to his wife, Lowell admits that he was complicit in this activity. In the meantime, long after the war, one of Custer's best friends was Thomas Rosser, who was a Southerner, and though not his roommate at West Point, he was a classmate of his. And after the war, Rosser went to work for the Northern Pacific Railroad as an engineer that was laying out the track bed. And he and Custer got together quite often. And Rosser would write, I saw a great deal of Custer while I was constructing the Northern Pacific Railroad and had many talks over the war with him. And he often stated that he was in no way responsible for the execution or murder of these men. The fact that Custer had been spotted in Front Royal on several occasions and it stood out in everybody's mind, the blame was focused on him instead of on the 2 guys that were really responsible for the hangings, which was Merritt, Lowell, and Torbert, Alfred Torbert, who was commanding the cavalry corps during the Shenandoah Valley campaign. So continuing on, we have, again, Custer just continues to be in the newspapers all the time. Here we have 2 different versions. This is the Battle of Tom's Brook, which occurred on October 9, 1864. And Custer would ride out in front of his men. And again, Tom Rosser is in the picture. Rosser is on top of a hill, and he looks at his men and he says, you see that man down there? That's Custer, whom the Yankees are so proud of. And I'm going to give him a whipping, the best whipping he ever got. See if I don't. And here we have 2 different versions of the same scene. One is by Alfred Wild. The other one is by James Taylor. The one by Wild, I don't believe Wild was present at the site at the time. And his is a very 2-dimensional sketch, whereas James Taylor was present on a hill overlooking the battlefield, and his picture shows Custer in motion. It's a much more active, much more action-driven version of the same scene. Then we get to the Battle of Cedar Creek, which October 19th of 1864. And in the process, Custer, who is on the left flank, Merritt, who's on the right flank. Sheridan's army is surprised and driven back, and Custer mounts an attack in which he captures 48 Confederate artillery pieces and quite a few of their battle standards, guidons, etc. And he writes a glowing letter to the men of his division at that time with pride and gratification. He goes on, capturing 45 of the 48 guns taken from the enemy on that day. You have surrounded the name of the 3rd Division with a halo of glory as enduring as time. So Custer obviously came in for his fair share of the glory. Well, Wesley Merritt took umbrage at that. He was not, he said he was present on the field. His men were as active as Custer's men had been active on the opposite flank, and he felt that Custer should have given him more credit than he was given for in the capture of the guns. And Custer is sent off to the Secretary of War's office where he presents the captured flags, and Merritt ends up writing a letter to the Assistant Adjutant General of the Cavalry Corps. And the unfortunate part of the whole thing was somehow or other, this letter ends up in the newspapers. And in it, he basically calls Custer a liar. He writes, but since this official recognition of overweening greed of some of the 3rd Division for the rightful captures of my command, I think it my duty to my officers and men to declare the statement alluded to above as without foundation in truth. So like I say, there's no doubt he's writing about Custer. Custer's already told his men they had captured 45 guns, and now this letter appears in the newspaper. As a result of this, Custer decides that he wants to bring this to the attention of Phil Sheridan and to have an investigation into his claim to the capture of the 45 guns and all the flags mentioned above. And Roger Hannaford, who was a member of the 2nd Ohio Cavalry, which was a part of Custer's 3rd Cavalry Division, says it came at last to hard words. Custer going so far as to say he would fight for his rights, and there was the possibility that it was going to end up in a duel. Of course, dueling was outlawed in the Army of the Potomac, and there was no way that anything such as Merritt and Custer engaging in a duel would be kept hidden. Sheridan decided the matter. He said, no, I saw Custer taking them. So in the end, Merritt had to kind of swallow his pride and just accept the fact that he was given credit for the capture of 3 of the guns. And what's really interesting about this particular event is that although their, how should I say, their enmity had extended over a period of time, probably dating back to as far as Brandy Station during 1863, and had a little bit of a preview in the official writings, in the official records during the Battle of Trevilian Station. This was the first time where their enmity had really broken out into the open. And no matter what Sheridan did, he was never able to put that genie back in the bottle again. And from that point on, theirs would be a very bitter, bitter enmity. And it only got worse as time went on. Here's an example of, well, I guess what you could say is that at this point in time, Custer decided that what he was going to do was to be that one thing that a commanding officer hates the most. He was going to be a thorn in Merritt's side. He was going to be an insubordinate officer. And by that time, he had gotten kind of used to operating on his own. So he decides he's going to ignore Merritt. And a case in point would be as the winter of 1864-65 came to a close, the remnants of Early's army is at Waynesboro, and Merritt issues orders that the main object at this time is to preserve the horses of the command. Commanding officers who conduct the march of the column will move slowly, accommodating the march to the character of the roads. The strength of the horse to the command must be husbanded. Well, Here it is. It's the end of the winter season. The roads are muddy. The snow is melting. Rain is pelting on occasions. And Custer's response, knowing that early as at Waynesboro, is the weather was stormy and the road from Wisconsin was knee deep in mud. The Hart Valley Pike terminating at this place, but this was no obstacle to the dashing Custer. Forward was the word. So in the end, Custer is miles ahead of Merritt's slow-moving column. He confronts early at Waynesboro, mounts a flanking attack, and totally destroys and routs Early's army. And for all intents and purposes, the Shenandoah Valley campaign is at an end. It's very easy to be objective about Custer because there's just so much material that's been written about him. There's hundreds of books, hundreds of magazine articles written about him. So we have all these accounts, and it's really easy to sit down and write the story of Custer during the Civil War. On the other hand, the study of Merritt is a lot more subjective. As I say, he was very self-effacing. He didn't write as much. There are no trunkfuls of communications between he and his family, he and his friends. After the war, Marguerite Merrington finds a trunk full of papers that Libby had stored away, just filled with all the correspondence that she and Custer had exchanged during the war. Well, there is no such thing as far as it existed with Merritt. So when we try to get a handle on Merritt's personality, we are forced to use his own writings, and he did quite a bit of writing after the war. He wrote in Battles and Leaders on Sheridan's campaign. He wrote about the Appomattox campaign. And in 1887, he founded the United States Cavalry Association. And part of that Cavalry Association was the Journal of the United States Cavalry Association, known as JUSCA. And it was a forum for anybody who was interested in cavalry to write about cavalry. And this included foreigners from Europe, Southerners, Union guys, everybody. So Merritt, to give the man credit, he was the guy that, because of his vision, because of his beliefs, he was the guy that took an army whose basic function was to police the western frontier and turned it into an army that was capable of fighting the European powers. Unfortunately, Merritt was to die before World War I. He wasn't able to see the fruits of his labor, but the army that went to Europe to fight in World War I had nothing to do with the police force that fought against the Native Americans on the western frontier, and it's pretty much owed to Wesley Merritt. General Merritt was a strong proponent of professional education. He contributed many articles and essays to the professional journals of his time. He was a leader in the move to change the Army from a frontier police force into a modern, well-equipped field army. So that's pretty much the presentation on the Shenandoah Valley. I have the information here. I have the different copies available, which at this time include volumes 1 and 2. Volume 3 is due out sometime towards the end of this year. And my address is alovies2016@gmail.com. And I also have my phone number listed there. Or they can reach through my publisher, which is Savas Beatty. And I have Savas Beatty's email address and telephone listed there. So that's pretty much it, Mike. If you have any questions for me.